So the RUG 3 home care system, RUG 3 HC system, is adapted from the RUG 3 system for nursing facilities. There are only a limited number of changes that are made. It looks a little bit different, but for the most part, it's the same. There are some RUG 3 variables that aren't in the intra-HC. For example, it doesn't have how many people it takes to support a person if they are, for example, unable to transfer. So that variable is not available in the intra-HC. It doesn't make a lot of sense in a home care setting. And so there are some changes in group definitions, and some groups are dropped. So it's a slightly smaller system, but it's very, very similar in terms of identifying individuals. On the other hand, it also, since many people in the home and community-based settings tend to be lighter care individuals relative to the nursing home, those light care groups that would be light care in nursing homes, tend to be very populous. A lot of people in those groups, and we were able to find other measures that we have available in the RIHC, the intra-IHC, that could in fact divide those groups. And those are around instrumental activities of daily living, the ability to shop or the ability to prepare your own meals. And so we developed a measure of IADLs that allow us to subdivide some of the lighter care groups. So those two changes, dropping some groups and some small changes in group definition and making additional groups for the light care people, create the differences between the RUG 3 home care system and the institutional RUG system. Next slide, please. So now let me move to the issue of case mix payment. And the one thing which I want people to understand, if there's one thing you walk out of this session with, I'd like you to understand that there's a substantial difference between case mix measurement and case mix payment. The way you go about developing a payment determination is there's an assessment of the individual, that then leads to a case mix measure, and that leads to a payment. But you have to separate those two pieces. Case mix is a scientific question. What is it about the individual that explains why these people are more costly than those people, or 20% more costly to care for than those people? Payment is a political issue. What are you going to acknowledge in the case mix system? Are you going to pay for security, or are you going to pay for the fact that people are further away in a home care setting and so it takes longer to get to them? How much are you going to adjust the payment for all of these issues? There is no scientific question. That's something that you and the state of Arkansas are going to have to battle out and come up with an appropriate answer to that. Hopefully it's not a battle. Hopefully you can come to some consensus about what the right way to handle it. But it's not a scientific question. So our suggestion is don't try to deal with case mix side of it, the measurement side. The science will deal with that. And the RUG 3 system is very effective in doing it. But there's an art as to how to build that into a payment system. Another way to talk about the differences is to recognize some of the things that Andy said, that case mix is going to only address particular costs of a payment system. It's not going to address capital costs. It's not going to address heating and lighting. Those don't vary with case mix. So once you have a case mix measure, you have to think about what it applies to. There are incentives that are built into payment, potentially, and you want to think about how you build those in. Those will be in the payment side. They aren't necessarily in the case mix side, although they could be. And then finally, case mix does more than just payment. That slide I started with by saying don't just think about case mix as payment, think about the other uses that it has. So separate case mix and payment. Next slide, please. So in thinking about how you're going to approach payment, we made some assumptions, and I think that these are pretty well agreed upon, but that the nursing facility payment is going to be on a bed day. There's not going to be any change. That's how you're paid now, on a per diem. That the rate is going to be based, at least in part, upon the RUG 4 case mix. It'll be determined by the MDS 3.0, and it'll be prospectively determined, but it's going to look back at historical costs in order to determine them. So if you go to the next slide, How are we going to do it in Arkansas? Well, at the 30,000-foot level, we're going to determine what are some of the alternative payment designs, what are the different ways that we can do it, what are the decisions that need to be made. Then we're going to simulate the payment designs and take a look at what happens. So what happens if we go back a couple years ago when we know what the costs are and we know what the case mix is? What would happen to facilities? What would happen to rural facilities or urban facilities? Or what would happen to the heaviest cost people and so forth? And use that to decide what is the preferred design of a payment system. How would you build case mix into the payment system, and potentially what other payment reforms that you want to have. Then once you have the design, then the state is going to have to determine what the overall budget is, the size of that pie is, and then use existing data on cost and so forth, and the design and the overall budget to get and calibrate rates. Okay, so at the 30,000-foot level, that's the process that we're going to be going through. Now the next slide, please. There you go. And so in thinking about these, what do you want as some of the goals? So how do you want to evaluate alternative payment systems? As I said, it's not a scientific question. It's going to be a judgment call. So I've suggested a whole bunch of ideas, and you can decide whether any of these make sense or whether other ones make sense. But here are some ideas of ways that you can think about it. You want to design a payment system that encourages admission for heavy care people. So it may, for example, you may want to have a system that pays more than the right amount, if you will, for heavy care people, overpays for heavy care people, and underpays for lighter care people to provide an incentive to admit heavy care people. Or it could just pay for those on admission. Only when they get admitted, say for the first 30 days, you get that additional payment. Do you want to have equitable payment rather than fiscal settlement? So you want to think about how do you pay prospectively for people. What is the right rate rather than going back and saying what you spent last year is how we pay for you now? Do you want to have regional wage adjustment? Should that be explicitly in the system? Should you automatically adjust wage for differences in regional wages? Or do you just assume that they're close enough that that type of adjustment isn't necessary? Do you want to make sure that high Medicaid facilities are viable and make sure the system doesn't harm those people? Do you want to pay for performance? I think you've agreed that you do want to think about that in terms of paying for different quality measures. Do you want to design the system in such a way that it minimizes first-year impact? It may be very problematic for some facilities to suddenly slam into a case mix system. What sorts of designs make sense in terms of making sure that facilities are warned, facilities understand the new rules, facility has time to change their practice patterns and change their fiscal patterns in order to deal with a new payment system? Do you want to make sure that you want to control future payment increases? So do you want to lock payments into, for example, some sort of a pricing model, which is fair, but then just gets controlled by inflation, or do you want to keep on going back and rebasing the rates? And how simple do you want the system to be? You can make simple systems. They may not work very well, but they're simple. Or do you want to have a more complex system that deals with particular encouragements? For example, some of these other examples that I've given above, those all make the system more complicated, but maybe they are the right thing to do. So you have to decide appropriateness versus, if you will, appropriateness of payment versus, say, simplicity. So those are only a small list of possible goals, but I think it's really important to start to articulate some of the things that you want in the system, because then you can evaluate the alternative possible payment systems using those particular criteria. Next slide. Let me now move to designing a home care payment system. There are two issues which I want to raise that are different. A lot of the things are the same. You have a case mix system, you do an assessment, that assessment leads to some sort of a payment design. And traditionally in nursing homes, it's going to pay a price or some sort of a cost limit on a per patient basis. When you talk about home care, it would probably be on something like a per month basis or per diem basis, somewhat the same way, but there are some other issues that you might want to not just predict payment. you might want to predict hours of care, or you might want to predict some sort of a funding level that could be used, for example, very flexibly by the consumer. So you'd say to the consumer, we'll give you this amount of money, and you can use it however you want, or you can use it only for these types of services, or you can use it for only this particular type of service, and so forth. So that's a decision that you can make. How do you want the system actually to be implemented? And then second of all, let's say that you're dealing with hours or funding. Let's say that the system says people in this case mix group should get 14 hours a week of care. Do you want to have some flexibility in assigning that, or would that be it? In other words, everybody around the state would get 14 hours if they're in that group. Or do you want to give agencies flexibility and say, well, you can give some people 20 hours of care, but then you'd better also find some people that you're giving 12 hours of care so that on the average you'll be giving 14 hours worth of care. So that's, again, some different types of payment design possibilities that you might want to consider in home care. Next slide. The second issue is around informal supports or natural supports. And it's an interesting problem with this part. We find that when we try to predict resource use, if we just predict formal services, we don't do very well. Nothing explains it. RUG3 explains it as well as anything, but RUG3HC explains much better when you combine formal and informal or natural support services. And it makes some sense because there is a trade-off. People who don't have a lot of natural supports will often have more formal care services and vice versa. So it makes sense that you want to predict the envelope of services. So that's what RUG3 does. It predicts the envelope of formal plus informal services. But of course, you're trying to figure out how much of formal services I provide to individuals. And so you have to think that at the front lines, someone's going to have to net out the informal services, the natural support services, in assigning it. So they'll be saying, well, we think you should be getting 14 hours of care, but we know that your sister is living with you and provides a lot of natural support. So of formal care services, you wouldn't tell them all of that, but you may say to them, we could give you 9 hours of care. Whereas somebody else who has nobody around, living by themselves, nobody nearby who can help them, you may be providing them more than 14 hours of care. Both of these issues, the informal and natural support services as well as the payment design, these are soluble problems. We are doing this in other states, but I want to raise it as being issues that will have to be decided in design of a home care payment system. Next slide. So my final slide is just to conclude a couple of statements. Case mix is an important application of assessment data. Assessment data, MDS3 or intra-HC, should be really done for one purpose primarily, and that is care planning. But once you have it, there are lots of other purposes that you can place it for. Case mix is a really important application, and it's nice that you don't have to collect any other data to be able to do it. Multiple uses, in fact, of the same data create offsetting incentives. So although there may be incentive in a payment system to report that the person has more problems than they actually have, those same upcodings also can provide a negative incentive through the quality assurance system, because then that person will look like they have worse quality because they have more pressure ulcers than everybody else. And so they will end up not getting funds or will look very poor on any quality measure. So when you use data for multiple purposes, there are offsetting incentives. RUGS has been very stable, very true, both in the U.S. and internationally. We think it's the right way to go about measuring case mix measurement, but when you start talking about a payment system, again, it's a political system, and I believe the state is looking for, and I'm looking for, your input on the design of how that system will be put in place.
You said that the heavy pay patients are backed up in the hospital, and I know that this is true in some cities.
It could
sometimes.
be. I don't know.
It could be, but so I was going to ask: do you know if that's Arkansas specific, or is that from your research in general?
That's from the research in general, just from a theory point of view. It was true in New York State when we implemented the case mix payment system in New York State, which was the first the system to use RUGS. There were 4,000 people who were backlogged in New York State hospitals, and they were, when we looked at them, all heavy care individuals. So I know it was true in that case, and in theory, this has been raised as an issue. Whether it's happening in Arkansas, I have no evidence one way or the other.
Okay.
Maybe
Well,
someone else there does.
yeah. Well, that's something that we can find out. So that's why I asked the question. And then this is kind of an aha moment. We've talked about this for months now, and it just clicked with me today between using on the home care side, using RUGS 3 versus RUGS 4 for the basis. Can you comment on, is that still going to help us across, you've heard our umbrella theory of how we want to do this. Is that going to hurt us in any way, or is it going to be easy to cross those between RUGS 4 on the long-term care side and using the RUGS 3 on the home care side? And how can we bridge those gaps if there are any?
It's a very good question. This is one of those, whenever you interrupt the stream of research, not everything is always lined up. So we developed RUG 3, then we developed RUG 3 home care. We've now more recently developed RUG 4, and we will be moving towards developing a RUG 4 home care at some point. Having said that, RUG 3 and RUG 4 are very similar, and some of the major differences between them are not particularly germane in the home care environment. They have to do with very, very sick people, and generally you don't see so many of them in home care. So, and second of all, the changes are not that great. They're relatively compatible. Are there some incompatibilities? Yes, there are, and that's something that we're going to need to address over time. If you want to directly compare the two populations, you can calculate a RUG 3 on the MDS 3.0 and a RUG 3 HC in the home care and directly compare it. But you're right, one payment system will be RUG 4 based and one will be RUG 3, and they're relatively similar.
Is there a descriptive element for the RUGS 3 home care design?
You mean, can you find out more about it?
Yes.
Yes. One way to find out more about it would be to go on our website, www.interrai.org, and we have a bibliography, and there's 2 papers on RUG 3 home care that members of the organization have had published, and one is the derivation methodology, and the other one is a validation study from Canada. And that'll give you a real good sense of how the system works.
And that website also has a smaller description of it as another way to take a look at it if you don't want to actually dig out the scientific article. And I'm sure that the department can make sure that those types of materials are available. I mean, they're in the public domain.